The invitation came in a plain white envelope, no markings beyond my name and address, almost as if someone wanted to remain anonymous while still telling me that something was happening. It was Boston, 1993. The Cold War was officially over, but some of its ghosts still lingered in the halls of military buildings and inside the hearts of men like me, who had served in silence. The letter said there would be a commemorative ceremony at the Commonwealth Club, honoring veterans who had served in intelligence operations between 1960 and 1980. I should have felt proud. I should have stood tall. But as I read the details, my hands trembled, because my name wasn't on the official list. I was used to erasure, used to working behind locked doors, behind maps and machines, behind assignments that had no names and missions that left no trace. And yet, I went. Not for a medal, not for recognition, but because I had something more valuable than any award they could pin to a chest. I had a letter, handwritten, carefully folded and tucked inside a blue envelope that still smelled faintly of lavender. It was the last letter I had received from her, Emily, a translator, a lover, a ghost that never stopped speaking to me. She died in 1973 under circumstances the army never explained, and that letter, it had been waiting for this day. When I arrived, the lobby was already full, men in pressed uniforms, women with tight smiles and polite nods. The air was sharp with aftershave and the perfume of old protocol. There were name tags at the check-in desk. I gave mine. The officer looked at the list, scanned the names, hesitated, and shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. You're not on the registry." The words stung more than they should have. Not because I needed validation, God knows I never expected any, but because it was the same silence all over again, the same institutional amnesia, the same message: you never existed. I stepped aside, tucked the envelope deeper into my blazer, and stood in the back, watching as men I once knew took their place in the spotlight. But then, as the final speech was winding down, and the brass began to loosen their ties and prepare for drinks and congratulations, a young woman stepped forward. She was maybe 25, brown hair, green eyes, eyes that reminded me of hers. Emily's eyes. She carried a worn envelope, and she asked to speak. Just for 1 minute, I heard her voice before I recognized the words. "My mother wrote this in 1973. She asked me to read it one day when the world was ready to remember. And from that moment on, nothing was ever the same." If this story is already touching you the way it touched me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. I was 23 when I was assigned to Fort Meade, Maryland, and handed a job description that didn't exist on paper. It was 1962, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. Cuba had missiles, Berlin had barbed wire, and Washington had secrets buried deeper than any trench in Europe. My official role was linguistic analyst, which sounded harmless enough, but in truth I worked in crypto, decoding intercepted Soviet transmissions, identifying patterns in scrambled communiques, and sitting for 12-hour shifts in a windowless room lined with equipment we weren't even allowed to name. We were trained not to ask questions. And we didn't, because in that building information was sacred. Silence, even more so. That's where I met her, Emily Caldwell. She was brought in from the Department of State as a liaison, trained in Russian, Polish, and just enough Mandarin to translate technical briefings. She wore her hair tucked back, her heels sensible, and her smile quiet, the kind that didn't demand attention but held it anyway. We weren't supposed to talk much, and yet we did. Little things, passed in between classified reports and coded messages. A remark about the weather, a borrowed pencil, a shared glance when someone said something absurd in the war room. Over time, we created a language of our own, not of words, but of signals. A coffee mug turned upside down meant she'd had a rough shift. A red paperclip tucked into the top left corner of a folder meant, "Meet me in the file room." We were careful, discreet. We knew the walls could hear, that our lives were under constant review by men with badges and clearances far above ours. But we also knew something else, that what we had was real, and that it mattered. We began exchanging letters, hidden in the spines of outdated field manuals and microfilm boxes no one ever checked. She wrote with a fountain pen, blue ink, delicate loops in her L's and E's. "There are so few things I believe in anymore," she wrote once, "but I believe in you. If someday no one remembers who I was, write it down. Let me exist in your story." I kept that line in my wallet for 30 years. Our relationship wasn't just a secret, it was a risk. Had anyone discovered us, it would have meant forced reassignment at best, a full investigation at worst. But we kept on, sending letters through courier bags, slipping notes into books labeled "Do Not Circulate," crafting an intimacy in margins and abbreviations in phrases no one else would understand. In 1968, Emily was temporarily relocated to the US Embassy in Bonn. It was supposed to be a 3-month assignment, assisting with intercepted West German and Soviet trade cables. I sent her notes hidden inside copies of the Atlantic Monthly. She sent me postcards of rivers and ruined castles, always signing them with the same 3 words, "Still decoding us." When she returned, things had changed. There were whispers about internal probes. Some of our colleagues had been reassigned. One man disappeared entirely. Emily stopped leaving notes. Our conversations became shorter. Her eyes, once steady and full of silent humor, now darted to every doorway, every shadow. I asked if she wanted to stop. She shook her head and handed me a folded sheet of paper. No envelope, no signature, just one sentence, written in all caps. "If I vanish, keep reading." The last time I saw her was November 14th, 1972. She handed me a classified brief, smiled faintly, and walked down the hall toward the elevator. She didn't look back. 2 days later, I received a memo stating she had been reassigned to a long-term project and was no longer in active contact. I asked questions. I got silence. Eventually, I stopped asking. 6 months later, a package arrived at my apartment in Bethesda. No return address. Inside was a single envelope, blue, worn at the corners, with my name in her handwriting. I stared at it for nearly an hour before opening it. Her words were calm, controlled, but I could feel the edges of fear in every line. "If you're reading this, it means the silence won. I'm sorry I didn't say goodbye. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. I loved you. Not in secret, not in shame, but in truth. You gave me a place in a world that didn't want me to have one. I hope you'll remember me not for what we couldn't be, but for what we were. If they don't call your name when the time comes, read mine instead. Speak it. Let me live there." I folded the letter, slid it into a book she once borrowed from me, Steinbeck's "The Moon is Down," and hid it in the second drawer of my desk. I never spoke about her again, not until that day in Boston. The room was already half full when I arrived. Men in dark suits, some in faded uniforms, their lapels heavy with ribbons and pins, chatting in low voices, exchanging rehearsed smiles and old war stories that had been polished for polite company. There were American flags behind the podium, a projection screen waiting for slides that would glorify sacrifice without ever mentioning the names that were too classified, too complicated, or too inconvenient. I stood near the entrance for a long moment, not quite sure whether I was meant to be here, even though I had served in silence longer than some of the men being honored had served at all. The check-in table was manned by a young officer, crisp haircut, pristine name tag, polite but distant demeanor. I gave him my name. He scanned his list once, then again, then looked up at me with a bureaucratic sort of pity that made my skin tighten. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "You're not listed as a confirmed participant." I asked if there had been a mistake. He offered to check again. He didn't. I stepped aside and tried to ignore the growing flush in my chest, the familiar sting of being unacknowledged, a sensation I'd become intimately acquainted with over the years. I had spent a decade decoding enemy transmissions, filtering out lies from truths, finding patterns where others saw only static, and doing so without recognition, without commendation, without even the right to say, I had done it. Now standing under chandeliers and in front of people who might have once read my anonymous reports and never known my name, I was being told once again that I did not belong. So I stood against the back wall. I didn't sit. I didn't mingle. I simply watched. One by one, the names were called. Captain Gerald Wolfe, applause. Major Thomas Green, more applause. Lieutenant Daniel Reyes, laughter, handshakes, photographs. They walked to the front with confidence, received their medals with pride, then returned to their seats beaming. And I stood there, unseen, unheard, holding a letter that I now realized I should have never let leave my desk drawer. Then came the moment I'd been dreading, or perhaps hoping for in some twisted, masochistic way. The general stepped up to the podium. He was tall, silver-haired, with that particular gravity of a man who had spent most of his life commanding others and had never once been questioned. His voice was slow, calculated, devoid of emotion. "We are aware," he said, "that there are some among us today whose names were not officially recorded in the manifest. Due to the sensitive nature of their assignments and the limits of declassification, not all contributions can be acknowledged." The words weren't cruel, but they were final, cold, bureaucratic absolution. It wasn't just the denial that hurt, it was the way the room accepted it without hesitation. No questions, no discomfort. Just a nodding silence that made me feel like I was fading again, piece by piece, right there on the carpet. I turned toward the exit. I couldn't bear to watch another man take a medal I might have earned, or hear another story that echoed something I had once lived but wasn't allowed to claim. I reached for the door handle. I was halfway out when I heard it. "Are you John?" The voice was soft, female, and close. I turned around slowly. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with brown hair pulled back in a loose knot and eyes that stopped me cold. Her resemblance to Emily was startling, though it wasn't just the features. It was the posture, the restraint, the way she held something in her hands, like it weighed more than it physically could. "I'm her daughter," she said, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. She reached into her coat and pulled out a blue envelope, aged but intact. My name was written on the front in Emily's looping, deliberate script. My hands shook as she passed it to me. I hadn't seen that handwriting in over 20 years, and yet it hit me like no time had passed at all. "She wrote this for you," the girl said, her voice steady. "She asked me to find you. If they ever refused to remember your name, I was supposed to read it." I stared at the envelope, and for a brief second, I considered telling her no, walking away, pretending I didn't know who Emily was or what the letter contained. But I couldn't. Not when she looked at me the way she did. Not when her voice trembled just slightly on the word, remember. "Will you let me read it?" she asked. I nodded. We stepped back inside, quietly. No one noticed. The ceremony was nearing its end. The general was seated again, half listening as another official thanked sponsors and donors. The room had lost some of its attention. People were whispering, already preparing to leave. She walked to the podium, bypassing the organizers. One of them reached out, but she ignored him. Her presence was soft, but unshakable. She unfolded the letter, and then she began to speak. The moment she unfolded the letter, time shifted, not in the way it does in movies, with music swelling and people gasping, but in a deeper, quieter way, like the pressure in the room had changed, like the air itself had realized something was about to be said that no one could prepare for, especially not the men sitting in the front row with medals pinned to their jackets and stories rehearsed, for polite applause, nor the general, who now sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, his jaw set just firmly enough to suggest that he still believed he was in control of the moment. She looked straight ahead, not at me, not at the audience, not even at the general, but somewhere past all of us, as though she was speaking to someone else entirely, someone who wasn't in the room, but who had never really left it. And when she began reading, her voice was steady, soft, and yet somehow filled every inch of space, as though each syllable were carried by memory itself. "To my dearest Jan," she read, and I felt the breath catch in my chest, because those words, those exact words, had once come to me in private, on paper that had traveled through hands it was never meant to touch, in a time when every sentence was a risk, and every truth had to be hidden beneath layers of protocol. And now, here they were again, spoken aloud, not in secret, but in light. "I don't know if history will ever honor you," she continued, and I could see heads turning now, subtle shifts in posture, as men who had been half listening began to realize that what was being said wasn't part of the official program, that this wasn't a planned tribute or a scheduled memory. It was something raw and unapproved and deeply, irreversibly human. "But my love always did," she said, and I felt the room stiffen, like everyone had collectively forgotten how to breathe, because love was not a word spoken here, not in rooms like this, not in ceremonies wrapped in flags and rank and hierarchy. But now, it was here, echoing through the silence, cutting through every speech that had come before it like a wire through fog. "You saved more lives with your silent listening than many did with guns," she read, and suddenly the general's face changed. Not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but I saw it, the way his eyes twitched ever so slightly, the way he blinked just once, slower than usual, as if hearing something he hadn't expected to hear again in this lifetime. Around him, murmurs began to ripple. Names were being spoken, quietly, urgently, among the older men in the front. Some leaned toward each other. I heard one whisper a designation I hadn't heard in decades. "Division 6. Another nodded, visibly shaken, as if recognizing not just the story, but the person at its center. "Me." "She wrote," the daughter said, her voice growing firmer, "because she knew one day they would forget you, and because she believed that if she said your name out loud, someone, anyone, would remember." By now the room was still. No one moved. No one checked their watches. Even the aides, who moments earlier had been preparing for post-ceremony logistics, stood frozen at the edges of the room, caught in something far too honest to interrupt. When she finished, she didn't say thank you. She didn't bow. She folded the paper slowly, placed it back into the envelope, and stepped down from the podium without a word. It was, I think, the most powerful speech I had ever heard, not because it praised accomplishments or victories, but because it resurrected something that had been buried. Everyone stood. I don't know who started it. It wasn't applause. It was something different, a reverent rising, a silent honoring. And though I knew they weren't standing for me as a person, not exactly, I also knew they weren't just standing for her either. They were standing for the truth, for all the things left out of reports, for all the names that never made it onto plaques, for all the people who served and never got to say why. I looked at the general, and for the first time, he looked back at me directly. There was no defiance in his expression anymore, only understanding, and something close to shame. The daughter returned to me quietly. She didn't say anything, but she took my hand and held it just long enough to let me know she knew. And in that grip, I felt the decades between us collapse. That room, that cold, formal room where I had once been told I did not exist, had become something else entirely. Not a place of hierarchy, not a place of rank, but a place of memory. And for the first time since 1972, I felt whole. When the applause faded, or rather when the silence that followed the reading finally began to soften, the general rose from his seat. He didn't rush. He didn't look toward the staff for guidance. He walked slowly toward the podium, one hand at his side, the other brushing the medals on his chest, as if unsure whether they still meant what they once did. The room remained still. Every eye followed him, but no one spoke, and no one dared interrupt the strange reverence that had taken hold since the letter was read. For a moment, I thought he might dismiss the entire thing, try to reassert control with protocol, with language. But when he reached the microphone, his voice was quiet, measured, and something in it had changed. "There are times," he said, "when records fail us, when files disappear, when memory bends under pressure." He paused, and the pause itself felt like an admission. There are men and women whose service was never documented, not because it didn't happen, but because it was never meant to be known. He turned toward me. Our eyes met, and then, in front of everyone, he said my name. "Jan Barrett," he said. "Please come forward." For a second, I didn't move. My body didn't seem to respond. After all those years of silence, of being erased, of letting others take the podium while I stood in shadows, I wasn't prepared to be called by name again. Not here, not now. But I stepped forward anyway, slow and uncertain, as if walking through a dream I hadn't dared imagine in decades. When I reached him, the general extended his hand. There was no ceremony in the gesture, no flair, just a simple, honest offering, one man to another. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Your name was left off the roster, not by accident, by design, but today we correct that." He reached into the box beside the podium and pulled out a medal. Not custom-made, not inscribed with any specific honor, just one of the standard-issue bronze service medallions they gave out when the records didn't match the story. He pinned it to my jacket himself. I didn't care that it was generic. I didn't care that it lacked detail, because it wasn't the medal that mattered. It was what came after. The daughter, Emily's daughter, approached the stage once more. She carried a small wooden box, old and worn, with a latch that barely held shut. Inside, carefully bundled and tied with twine, were letters. Dozens of them, all in the same handwriting, all addressed to me. She kept writing, the daughter said, her voice quiet but unshaken. Even after she stopped sending them, even after she was relocated, she wrote to you for years. I took the box in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, not in weight, but in meaning. I opened it right there, unable to wait. Each letter was dated, some written on plain stationery, others on napkins or the backs of official memos. Some were long, others were just a few lines, but all of them were for me. Me, the man the army had tried to forget, the man she never could. She told me, her daughter said, that someday you would need to hear her again, even if only through paper. I don't remember what I said, or if I said anything at all. My throat burned, my hands trembled. Hands. I felt like the past had finally caught up with me, not to punish me, but to return something I thought I had lost forever. Her voice. After the ceremony, I didn't stay for drinks. I didn't mingle. I left quietly, with the box tucked under my arm and the medal still pinned to my jacket. I walked through the streets of Boston, past monuments and traffic and the kind of noise that always feels too loud after something sacred. I didn't stop until I reached the park near the river. I sat on a bench and opened the first letter. It was dated June 3rd, 1975. "My dearest Jan," it began, "the world keeps spinning even without you in it. Or maybe it just feels that way because I still measure time by when we last spoke. I wonder if you hear my words even when I don't send them. I wonder if silence has become your language too." She had written through years, through presidencies, through deployments and debriefings and entire administrations. She had written through forgetting, through distance, through grief. And now those letters, those quiet acts of rebellion and love, had brought me back into the light. Later, back home, I laid them all out on the dining table. I didn't rush through them. I let each one sit with me like a conversation resumed after a long absence. They weren't dramatic. They weren't poetic. They were just honest, human, and in their simplicity, they gave me something no medal ever could: belonging. She never asked me to write back. She never demanded an answer. But in each letter, there was an invitation, not to respond, but to remember. To keep her alive, to keep myself alive. The general may have given me a medal. But Emily, through her words, through her daughter, through that final act of remembrance, gave me back my name. I went home with the medal still pinned to my jacket, but it wasn't the weight of bronze that stayed with me. It was the box of letters. Her voice finally returned to me, not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as something real, tangible, unburied from the silence where they had left both of us. I set the box down on my desk, beside an old photograph of us taken in 1966, blurry and unofficial, snapped in secret during a group retreat no one dared talk about later. Her eyes were half closed from laughter. Mine were watching her. That night I didn't sleep. I read until the sun came up. Letter after letter, spanning more than a decade, each line written with the kind of tenderness only possible when one knows there may never be a reply, and yet still writes. She told me about the books she was reading, about the people who disappeared, about the war of omission that had become our legacy. And in between those words, tucked carefully and never directly stated, was the truth of what we were. We were real. We were in love. And we had mattered, even if no one wanted us to. I framed the first letter she ever wrote to me. It hangs above my desk now, not as decoration, but as testament, as survival. When I glance up from the morning paper or from the bills that still come like clockwork, I see her handwriting, and I remember, not just her, but myself, the man I was before the silence, the man I was with her. What no one tells you about war, especially a war fought in code and shadows, is that it doesn't just destroy cities or steal lives. It steals names. It edits stories. It tells you that to serve is to disappear. And for years, I believed that. I let myself fade. I let her become a memory I didn't speak of. But her letters, her words, rewrote that ending. She didn't survive the Cold War, but her voice did. And through her daughter, through that single act of reading the letter aloud, I was given something I never expected: a return, a resurrection, a moment where the world, even for just a few minutes, remembered that not all battles are fought on the front lines, and not all heroes wear rank. Now, when someone asks me about my service, I don't hesitate. I say, I listened, I waited, I remembered. And when they ask me who I did it for, I tell them the truth. For Emily. We post new videos every day, true stories that move and inspire.